Well, I know that you're a fan of, since we talk about it once in a while, you're a big Atari VCS or 2600 fan. And I know you have a large collection
I do.
of Atari games.
I do.
Talk about how you got into Atari when you first played it as a kid and
Oh
why,
my
why you
God.
love it.
Yeah. Okay. Atari. So Atari is that was my first. Well, the Atari was my sister's console. She's older than me, and she had the Atari, and I remember it being like 1983 or something. I'm 3 years old, and I was playing like Star Voyager on Atari 2600, and I think we had Jungle Hunt and Phoenix and those kind of games. And I remember I was playing the game, and I don't know what happened, but there was a screwdriver in the room that we had, and I took the Atari controller apart with the screwdriver because I'm a 3-year-old kid,
Mhm.
and my sister comes back into the room and she's like, "What did you do to the Atari controller?" She was like screaming at me. She calls my parents in. Like it was this big scene. Like I broke the Atari, and then my dad couldn't get it back together or anything, and that's one of my early memories is me taking apart the Atari
Was
controller.
it broken or are you just a little
I,
brat? You're trying to take it apart?
I was so young, I literally didn't know what I was doing. I was just like goo goo gaga, drooling on myself, and I like took the control just because I was a baby, basically.
Mhm.
And but I remember the Atari and I remember liking it and stuff. And as I got older, and we had an other controller, so we were still able to play the games and stuff. But and we had PAL controllers and we played Breakout and all that stuff. So that's some of my early memories playing Atari. I was very very young, and then I remember I was probably like 4 or 5 years old, something like that, being like a 5 year old going to the roller rink, and our roller rink had an arcade, and that was my first experience going into an arcade. And we used to go there. My sister used to always do roller skating, and I'd always go to this arcade that they had, and they had like Pac-Land, and they had Space Invaders, and there was just a whole arcade full of those that era of games, early '80s arcade games, and that's really where my first love for video games came from. I would say is those that being in an arcade with kids from the early '80s, and I was very young. I was like 5 year old kid, but seeing other kids who were 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, and maybe a little older going around playing the games and being in an arcade and experiencing that like a real arcade at that time, it was life changing to me at a very young age. And I realized I would see the art. I would see like the Pac-Man with the pie eyes, and I would see Food Fight and all that stuff, and I loved the artwork. It's probably one of the things that got me into wanting to draw and all that. And so I loved the arcades. And then, so if that wasn't enough, then on top of that, then I got the NES like a year or two later, and then I fell in love with Legend of Zelda, and these are just all the things that turned me into who I am now with
Sure.
all this
So
junk.
so how big is your Atari collection?
I have, I mean, you can see on our website if you want to know exactly. I have them all listed, but I have every Atari game almost, except for maybe about 10 to 15 games
The
that are
ones
really,
that
really
are like
rare.
so regional, like Gamma Attack and
Yeah.
Red Sea Crossing, the ones that you got to
Hmm.
spend thousands to get one,
Yes.
basically.
Yeah.
But
I
like
I have some.
what's that?
I mean, I have some rare ones. I have
Air
like
Raid.
I don't have air raid, but I have I have like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and a
Yeah,
Halloween.
Manja.
I think I do actually. I think yeah, I do have Manja.
I want that one.
I
That's one with the
think
cat. You can blow up from eating too much spaghetti.
yeah, I think I have Manja. I'd have to look and see what I have, but
um,
I love Atari. Yeah, it's great.
yeah, I remember playing Atari at my cousin's before we got an NES. I remember they claimed after a while they wouldn't. They play like Spider Man was a big one. That's a classic. And then I remember them playing Adventure a lot, and
Mm,
that was too complicated for me
yeah,
as a kid. Probably too
me,
complicated for me now.
me too. Yeah.
Um, but then I remember they stopped letting me play. My cousins, they claimed they broke the joystick, which is total BS. Those joysticks were broke by themselves, but they said I broke the joystick. They never let me play after that. But then even when I had an NES when I was like 9, my neighbor Billy had an Atari 2600. I remember trying to buy it from him and see if his parents would let me. They wouldn't let him sell it with his games because I just like the simplicity of it, even compared to an NES.
Hmm.
So I guess that was my early foray into video game history and retro was back
Right.
then. Atari 2600 was retro in the late 80s. I remember playing still one of my favorite Atari games, Keystone Capers, one of my favorite Atari
Yeah,
games.
Activision, right? Um,
Yeah,
let me ask you a question about Atari. So what I find these days is that a lot of people don't seem to care as much about Atari as they do, let's say, NES or Super Nintendo. And I noticed that, let's say, there's a lot of people on YouTube now. Like when we started, it was a smaller community, but now there's people like Game Grumps and stuff, and you don't really see all these people, people on Screw Attack and whatever, and all the different people on YouTube. People aren't playing Atari games very much. But everybody's playing NES. People will play Super Mario, they'll play Zelda, they'll play any Contra games on NES, but nobody does Atari. And I'd like to know, do you have any answer to why people don't play Atari?
Well, I think I spoke about this before, that I get asked this question every once in a while. Whenever the rare times I do either a radio interview or interview for a magazine or whatever else, they tend to always ask this question. And I think me and Ian have discussed it before on and off on the podcast, maybe not in that much detail. There's a few different reasons why I think the Atari is forgotten. You start with the number one is that the fan base is a lot older. The kids that grew up with Atari are now in their 40s, if not 50s.
Mm-hmm.
By now, it's a console that came out almost 40 years ago already,
Right.
in 77. So you have to consider that, late 77.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first one. Number two, a lot of those franchises are dead. So you don't have Centipede is dead for all intents and purposes.
Right.
You're not seeing people do updates of games like Adventure or Star Raiders.
Donkey Kong and Mario Brothers are on Atari.
Sure, but I'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
That's a good point you bring up. I'll get to why that's an exception in a second. And plus, I don't consider Donkey Kong a 2600 game, classic game. But anyway, it's more ColecoVision. But anyway, all those franchises are dead, and Atari's dead. Atari's basically broken up into other companies that have bought and sold at 14.
Nintendo's still a company, right?
Nintendo's still a company, a huge company.
Right.
You're still reminded of these franchises every day. Mario is the most recognizable video game character in the world, and probably will be until we're dead. He's the Mickey Mouse of video games.
He is.
Nintendo's still relevant. There has been an Atari console in 20 years, and it was a massive failure. So there has been a successful Atari system since the 2600.
Right.
So there has been, in almost 35 years, it has been a successful system.
Right.
Like I said, there's no good franchise anymore. Whenever they try to remake Centipede or Warlords, they fail. They don't have the fan base, and there's no recognizable character. And that gets me to Donkey Kong and Mario.
Okay.
They're recognizable. They're like cartoon characters. Like you see the box art, you said, or the box art, the cabinet art, you see the characters. You can decipher those characters.
Also, Pac-Man, by the way, because Pac-Man is like in Smash Brothers and whatever.
Pac-Man, to me, that's not an Atari character, though. That's just more...
That's true. It's arcade.
Old school classic, character that's Namco, its own franchise.
True.
So, and even that kind of suffered for a bit, Pac-Man. He's not as popular as he once was.
That's true.
Compare to someone like Sonic or Mario. So, Nintendo, the NES was the first home system, that you had really recognizable and decipherable characters that you can look at and say, that's a plumber, that's a giant gorilla that actually looks like a gorilla, not on the 2600 on television where it's blocky brown parts.
Right.
We have a living, breathing world in the Mushroom Kingdom, a living, breathing world in Hyrule that you could not do that before on a console.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you could, it's Adventure, where it's just rooms of blocky mess.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't inspire the imagination, I think, as much as the NES first did.
So
it didn't. You could have like cute box art on an Atari system, but when you're playing the game, you don't see it. It doesn't translate.
So I agree with all that, and that's a very good answer, I think. And I think you're right, and that probably is why the Atari is more forgotten. And the fact that the Atari is forgotten, do you think the Atari games still have the ones that are like unique to Atari, the ones that were like only on Atari? I know like a lot of them have ports and arcade games, but there was games like I think like River Raid and Kaboom.
I was going to say River Raid.
Yeah, there you go. There's Pitfall and things that were like only on Atari. Do you think that games like that, and for those reasons, that the Atari has merit, and that it's a shame that people are forgetting it because the system does have merit, but everybody's forgetting it?
I don't know if it's a shame. It's just what people are interested in. I mean, video game historians will always look back at games like River Raid. Or a game like Pitfall, where it's like one of the earliest examples of a platformer, and they'll remember it for that. And it was one of the the first games where you had different screens walking up and down. And Pitfall is a fantastic game for the time. Mm-hmm. It's just that I think at some point there's a line of simplicity that gets crossed from the VCS to the NES. That it's not a small one either; it's a big one.
Because the way I grew up was that you played. it was kind of like you start with Atari because there's such simple games. You're a really
Yeah.
little kid. It's very basic. You can pick it up and play it, and that's like how you kind of learn to play video games. Then you move on to NES because the NES is a little more involved and complicated. And then you can from there you move on to Super Nintendo, you move on to Genesis, and you
Sure.
kind of work your way up. So I feel like for kids, like Atari is a good way to start playing video games. And I mean, there's a million games out there now. Now kids are playing, games on their
I was going to
cell
say,
phones and stuff.
maybe for your generation, but nowadays kids are growing up with smartphones in their hands at 2 years old and learning how to play games a lot more complicated than Atari games.
That's true.
So it all depends upon your generation, I think, on how how you learn.
So it's a generational thing.
I like it in the fact that I'm not saying Atari VCS games are akin to silent films, but we'll just say before at the Pong system,
Which I also like, by the way, silent animation.
I was just going to say the original Pong systems of the 70s, all those all the Magnavox 100s, even the original Magnavox Odyssey, those are like silent films. And then the Atari VCS is more like the early talkies and movies made from the late 20s, early 30s. So while you can still appreciate the groundwork they laid, it's hard to identify with them, going forward.
Did you ever think about video games in sort of like comic books? Like there's the Bronze era, there's the Silver
Age,
the Gold.
So I would even say Atari VCS is even the Golden Age. That's like the Platinum Age. Before you had superhero comics, you had pulps.
What's the NES? What age is the NES in?
What's that?
What age would you put the NES in?
Oh, the Golden Age. I'd put the NES. Like you always say, the Golden Age of like arcades was like 80 to 83, 84. And I think the problem was, part of Atari's problem was you couldn't translate those games over to the system.
I like to do the same thing with cartoons. So a lot of times these are the things I think about in my head. So I'll be like, okay, the golden age of cartoons was like your Warner Brothers, your Looney Tunes, and all that kind of thing. So I'm kind of like, so basically the NES is your Bugs Bunny, and the Atari is your Felix the Cat.
Maybe. Did Felix come before Bugs Bunny, or came in the 50s?
Felix the Cat was like the 20s silent animation.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The 10s even. It goes back to like 1919 or something. Otto Mesmer.
Great NES game, by the way.
It is a great NES game. It was on my top 10 NES gems.
Someone might have rated it 4.5 stars in a certain NES guidebook.
A certain book that is coming out.
Well, I waited almost an hour to plug it.
Yeah. Is it available now? Or not yet?
You can still pre-order it. The digital version is fully available. I got to set up my shop.
So people have seen it now.
What's that?
So people have now read it and seen it?
Oh, yeah. People have downloaded it. The Slacker backers on PayPal and the Kickstarter backers have their copy.
Okay.
And I'm finalizing the print version this week, but enough of plugging my book. We can talk about that later. So, yeah, that's why I think...
Well, I'm not even thinking about your book as a plug. I don't even care. I just think that it's a cool idea that that there even is an NES book. Like you can pick up a book and you open it up and it's like, okay, here's 10-yard fight or whatever, and here's whatever, the different games, and then there's a picture of the game and there's an article about it. It's a book that I would read.
Golf Power. Here's Gunman.
I mean, I think if you're into NES, it's something that you would want to have. And I'm not trying to plug your book or whatever. I just think, even if it wasn't you, if somebody else in the future makes a book on NES, it's just cool. I want to, I'd like to see it done for like Super Nintendo or whatever. It's kind of cool to be able to open a book and like pick out any game and read about it. I think that's really cool.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Super Nintendo book is done. It probably won't be by me, or else I can sort of be I'll write 80 of them, but I ain't writing 450 of them. Mm-hmm. That's for sure. I'm not doing that again.